The alarm clock didn't ring at 5 in the morning because William Thornton didn't need one. 43 years of military discipline had carved the rhythm into his bones deeper than any machine could reach. His eyes opened in the darkness of the trailer, the same darkness that greeted him in foxholes and barracks, in temporary posts across 3 continents, in 2 wars. The ceiling above him sagged slightly in the corner where water damage had weakened the composite board. He'd patched it twice with duct tape and prayers, but gravity was patient, and trailers were not built to last. Bill sat up slowly, feeling his spine protest in 3 distinct locations. 72 years of living, most of them hard. The floor was cold against his bare feet, cheap linoleum that had been installed when Nixon was president and had outlived its warranty by 4 decades. He stood in his boxers and undershirt, the same white cotton he'd worn in service, and moved through the darkness with the precision of a man who knew every inch of his territory. 18 steps from the bedroom to the bathroom. 3 more to the shower stall that was barely large enough for a man of his frame. The water heater coughed before surrendering hot water. Bill had learned to accept the 30-second delay, using it to stretch his shoulders and work the stiffness from his knees. The scar on his left thigh, a souvenir from Quezon that had nearly cost him the leg, ached in the cold. It always did. He'd stopped taking pills for it 15 years ago when Patricia told him she worried about addiction. She'd been right to worry. Half the men he served with had fallen into that particular pit, chasing away ghosts with chemicals that only made the ghosts multiply. He showered quickly. Military efficiency never forgotten. Water was precious even when it flowed freely from rusted pipes. Soap, rinse, done. He shaved with an old straight razor that had belonged to his father, the blade honed on a leather strop Patricia had given him on their 10th anniversary. The man in the mirror looked back at him with gray eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. His hair was white now, cropped close in the same style he'd worn since boot camp in 1970. The face was weathered, creased with lines that mapped decades of sun and stress and sorrow. But the jaw was still firm, the posture still straight. A colonel didn't slouch, even when there was no one left to salute. He dressed in jeans that were clean but worn, a flannel shirt Patricia had bought him 3 Christmases before she died, work boots that had another year in them if he was careful. The trailer was cold despite the space heater laboring in the corner, its electric coils glowing orange against the November chill that seeped through walls never meant to insulate Wyoming winters. Bill moved to the kitchen, a generous term for the 3 feet of counter space, and a 2-burner stove that required percussive maintenance to ignite. Coffee was a ritual, not a luxury. He measured the grounds precisely, filled the ancient percolator with water from the tap that always ran slightly brown for the first few seconds, and set it on the stove. While it heated, he dropped to the floor and began his push-ups. 50 was the goal. Some mornings his arms shook by 30. Today was a good day. He counted silently, breathing in through his nose and out through his mouth, the same way Sergeant Brooks had taught him in 1970, when the world was young and death was still an abstraction. At 47, his right shoulder cramped, old rotator cuff injury from a helicopter crash in the Gulf. He pushed through it. 48, 49, 50. He held the last position, arms locked, feeling the tremor in his muscles, then rose smoothly to his feet. The coffee was percolating, filling the trailer with a smell that made the space feel less like a box and more like a home. He poured a cup into a mug that read "World's Best Dad" in faded letters, a Father's Day gift from Rebecca when she was 7 years old and still believed her father hung the moon. The coffee was black and bitter and perfect. He stood at the small window over the sink, looking out at the trailer park as dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Rows of mobile homes in various states of decay stretched across the lot, most of them housing men like him, veterans who'd given their youth to the flag and received just enough pension to survive, but not enough to live. Tom Pearson's trailer sat dark and silent. Tom had died 4 months ago, heart attack at 68, found by his daughter when she finally remembered to check on him after 3 weeks of unanswered calls. The park manager had cleaned out his belongings and posted a "for rent" sign that still hung crooked on the door. Bill wondered how long it would take them to do the same to his trailer when his time came. How many days before someone noticed the lights staying dark? He pushed the thought away and checked his phone, a flip model from 2015 that he'd bought used because smartphones felt like surveillance devices, and he'd spent enough of his life being watched. No messages, no calls. The screen showed the date, November 14th, and the temperature, 32 degrees. His breath fogged the window as he watched a stray cat pick its way between the trailers, hunting for scraps or warmth or whatever it was that kept small creatures moving through a world designed to crush them. The sun was rising properly now, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray. Bill finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and set it in the dish rack to dry. He pulled on his jacket, a canvas work coat lined with fleece that had seen better decades, and stepped outside into air that bit at his face and made his eyes water. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked the perimeter of his lot, a habit from 50 years of checking defensive positions. Everything was as he'd left it. The propane tank was still half full. The electrical connection was secure. The plastic skirting around the trailer's base was intact. Old habits from old wars and old times when the enemy wore uniforms and you knew which direction the bullets would come from. He climbed into his truck, a 1987 Ford F-150 that burned oil and needed a new transmission, but still started on cold mornings if he pumped the gas pedal exactly 3 times before turning the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, caught. Blue smoke drifted from the exhaust pipe. Bill let it warm up for 2 minutes, watching the temperature gauge climb toward operational range while morning light spread across the landscape of his reduced circumstances. The drive into town took 15 minutes along county roads that needed repaving and probably wouldn't get it. Bill knew every pothole, every frost heave, every place where the asphalt had surrendered to erosion and weather. He drove past ranches that still operated, their gates proud and fences maintained, land passing from father to son in unbroken chains of inheritance and tradition. He'd grown up on a ranch like that. His father had raised cattle and horses on 300 acres of Wyoming grassland, building something meant to last. But that was before the split, before the choices that divided brothers and sent Bill into uniform, while Jim stayed home to build an empire. He didn't think about Jim often. Thinking about Jim meant thinking about 40 years of silence, 40 years of stubbornness, 40 years of a wound that never quite healed. His twin brother, his mirror image who'd chosen a different reflection. The garage where Bill worked part-time sat on the edge of town, a cinder block building with 2 bays and a hand-painted sign that read, Honest Abe's Auto Repair. The owner, Abraham Lincoln Washington, had been born to sharecroppers in Alabama and named by a mother who believed in presidents and possibilities. Abe was 75 and still turned wrenches because Social Security didn't cover much and pride covered even less. Bill parked and found Abe already under the hood of a Chevy Suburban, his dark hands stained with grease and experience. "Good morning, Colonel," Abe said without looking up. The title wasn't mockery, it was respect, the kind earned in fire and never forgotten. "Morning, Abe. Got that alternator job if you want it. Shouldn't take more than 2 hours." Bill nodded and grabbed his toolbox from the truck. The work was simple, almost meditative. Remove the serpentine belt, disconnect the electrical connection, unbolt the old alternator, install the new one, reverse the process. His hands knew the motions without thought, muscle memory from decades of keeping machines running in conditions that made this heated garage feel like luxury. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the clank of tools and the occasional question about bolt sizes. Abe had served too, Army infantry in Korea, and understood that some men process the world better through work than words. At noon they broke for lunch, sitting on overturned buckets and eating sandwiches Abe's wife had packed. Ham and cheese on white bread with yellow mustard, an apple, and a handful of store-brand cookies. "Kids coming for Thanksgiving?" Abe asked between bites. Bill chewed slowly, considering his answer. "Haven't heard from them." Abe grunted, a sound that contained volumes of understanding. His own children called every Sunday without fail, a blessing he never took for granted and never mentioned, because he knew Bill's situation and kindness sometimes meant silence. They finished eating and returned to work. Bill completed the alternator job and moved on to an oil change, then a brake inspection, then a tire rotation. The hours passed in increments of solved problems and small victories. Abe paid him $90 in cash at the end of the day, 20s and 10s counted out from a metal box kept under the counter. Bill folded the bills carefully and tucked them into his wallet, which now contained $212, his entire liquid net worth. Rent on the trailer was $400 a month. It was due in 6 days. He drove home as evening fell, the sky darkening from blue to purple to black. The trailer park looked different at night, windows glowing with the warm light of other people's lives. Televisions flickered behind curtains. The smell of cooking drifted on cold air. Someone's dinner creating momentary community through shared hunger and shared solutions. Bill heated a can of soup on the stove and ate it with crackers, standing at the counter because sitting at the table meant acknowledging he was eating alone, and some truths were easier to swallow standing up. He washed his bowl and spoon, dried them, put them away. He checked the locks on the door and windows, another old habit that felt foolish in a trailer park where the most valuable thing anyone owned was probably a television. But habits existed independent of context. He sat in his recliner, the one piece of furniture he'd kept from the house he'd shared with Patricia. The fabric was worn smooth in places. The mechanism creaked when he leaned back, but it held him the way it had held him through 1,000 evenings of news and books and quiet companionship. The television stayed off. Bill preferred silence to the noise that passed for entertainment or information. He picked up the photograph from the side table, the frame cheap plastic, but the image priceless. Patricia on their wedding day, 1975, her smile bright enough to power cities. She wore a simple white dress because they couldn't afford elaborate and didn't want it anyway. He wore his dress uniform, Marine Corps blue, the few medals he'd earned by then pinned over his heart. They looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful, impossibly unaware of what 50 years of living would cost them. She'd died 6 years ago, cancer that started in her breast and spread with the efficient cruelty of an enemy that took no prisoners. The final months had been hard, watching strength fade from a woman who'd been his foundation, his compass, his reason for coming home from wars that tried to keep him. She died in a hospice room that tried to feel homey but only felt like a place people went to surrender. Her last words to him, whispered through morphine fog, were, "Don't be alone, Bill. Promise me you won't die alone like Jim." He'd promised. It was a lie, but it gave her peace, and sometimes love meant lying when the truth was too heavy for dying hands to carry. Bill set the photo down and closed his eyes, not sleeping but not quite awake, existing in the space between where memories lived with more clarity than the present. He heard Patricia's laugh. He felt her hand in his during a movie they'd watched at a drive-in theater that no longer existed. He smelled her perfume, something floral and inexpensive that she'd worn on special occasions because daily wear seemed wasteful. The knock on the door startled him back to the present. He checked his watch, 8:15. Late for visitors in a place where most residents went to bed with the sun to save on electricity. He stood, joints protesting, and moved to the door. Through the small window he saw Doc Martinez, her face lined with concern and something else he couldn't quite read. He opened the door and cold air rushed in along with Sarah Martinez, who'd served as an Army surgeon in 3 combat zones and now practiced medicine from a small office in town, treating mostly veterans and poor families who paid what they could or didn't pay at all. "Doc," he said, "everything all right?" She stepped inside and he closed the door against the cold. She wore jeans and a heavy sweater, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence that age had refined rather than dimmed. "Bill, we need to talk. Can I sit?" He gestured to the sofa and she settled onto cushions that had lost their spring decades ago. He returned to his recliner, watching her face, reading the tension in her shoulders. They'd known each other since Fallujah in 2006, when he was advising Iraqi forces and she was putting soldiers back together in a field hospital that took mortar fire twice a week. They'd saved each other's lives in ways both literal and figurative, building the kind of friendship that only forms in crucibles. "I ran into Martha Phillips at the grocery store," Doc said. "She works at First National Bank." Bill nodded, waiting. Martha was a nice woman who'd processed his pension deposits for 15 years and always asked about his health with genuine concern. "She pulled me aside," Doc continued, "said she wasn't supposed to say anything but thought I should know. Your account, Bill, it's been frozen." The words didn't immediately connect. Frozen. Like meat, like water, like time. "What do you mean frozen?" "Closed. Transferred. Martha said someone with power of attorney came in 2 weeks ago and moved all the funds to a trust account. She thought you knew. She thought you'd authorized it." Bill felt something cold spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Power of attorney, The papers, the kids, the lawyer with the expensive suit and the smooth voice talking about protection and security and responsible management. How much? He asked, his voice flat. Everything, Doc said quietly. Your pension account, your savings, everything. Martha said it was over $180,000. The number hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun that had already fired. $180,000. 43 years of military service. 43 years of pension deposits that added up slowly, month by month, year by year. Every deployment bonus saved. Every tax refund deposited. Every spare dollar from part-time work added to the pile. Money meant for the end, for the inevitable nursing home or medical emergency or funeral that would come when time ran out. Gone. Bill stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. Not because he needed anything, but because his body needed to move or it might shatter. He gripped the edge of the counter and stared at the coffee maker without seeing it. Behind him, Doc's voice was careful. Bill, did you sign something? Give someone authority over your accounts? The memory came back with perfect clarity. The trailer feeling smaller than usual with 3 adult children and a lawyer crowded into it. Jackson's voice, smooth and concerned. Rebecca's tears, calculated and convincing. Kyle's legal jargon that sounded protective. The paper spread across his small table. The pen in his hand, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Patricia's voice in his memory, her last request. Don't die alone, Bill. And so he'd signed, because they were his children, and you trusted your children even when your gut screamed warnings in the same voice that had kept you alive in ambushes and firefights. I signed, he said, still staring at nothing. They said it was for protection, a trust, standard procedure for veterans. I believed them. The silence stretched. Doc Martinez had seen enough battlefield trauma to recognize different kinds of wounds. Financial evisceration was just another way to bleed. There's more, she said finally. Martha said the account transfer happened 2 weeks ago. Your rent check bounced last week. The park manager's been trying to reach you. Bill turned to face her. How long do I have? She pulled an envelope from her jacket pocket and set it on the counter. I found this taped to your door. You must have missed it. He opened the envelope with steady hands despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. The notice was printed on standard letterhead, impersonal and efficient. Failure to pay rent, 3 months overdue. He hadn't known because the bank had been handling automatic payments from his account, the account that no longer existed. Eviction proceedings. 30 days to vacate or face forcible removal. 30 days to find a new place to exist when you had $212 and no way to earn $400 before time expired. Bill folded the notice carefully and set it aside. His mind was already moving through options with the systematic approach of a man trained to solve tactical problems. Call the bank, file a police report, contact legal aid, fight the power of attorney, sue for return of funds. Each option ran into the same wall, the wall of time and money and energy that 72-year-old men didn't have in sufficient quantities to wage legal war against children who'd planned their attack with precision. Can you stay with someone, Doc asked, until you figure this out? Bill shook his head. Everyone he knew was struggling with their own survival. Burdening friends with homelessness wasn't friendship. I'll be fine, he said, and the lie tasted like all the other lies he'd told himself and others when fine meant anything but. Doc stood and moved to stand beside him. This small woman who'd held together soldiers with hands and will when supplies ran out and hope ran dry. Bill, you're not fine. This is elder abuse, financial exploitation. It's illegal. Legal and justice aren't the same thing, he said. You know that? She did know that. They'd both seen enough of the world to understand that courtrooms were battlefields where victory went to whoever could afford the best weapons, and his children had just stolen his ammunition. Let me help, she said. I have some savings. No, the word came out harder than he intended. You're not funding my life, Sarah. You've got your own retirement to worry about. Then let me make some calls. I know a lawyer who does pro bono work for veterans. Bill nodded because refusing all help was pride becoming stupidity, and he could still recognize the difference. Doc pulled out her phone and stepped outside to make her calls, leaving Bill alone with his thoughts in the eviction notice and the photograph of Patricia smiling from a past that felt like someone else's life. He sat back down in his recliner and picked up the phone, the ancient flip model that suddenly felt like a connection to people who'd severed all other ties. He scrolled through his contacts. Jackson, Rebecca, Kyle. his children, his blood, the people he'd raised and sacrificed for and loved with the fierce devotion of a man who believed family was the only thing that mattered when everything else burned. He selected Jackson's number and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Jackson's voice, confident and professional. "You've reached Jackson Thornton. Leave a message and I'll return your call." Bill hung up without speaking. He tried Rebecca. Same result, her voice bright and busy. "Hi, you've reached Rebecca Thornton Sterling. I'm probably showing a property right now, but leave your name and number and I'll call you back." Kyle's number went straight to a recording that the customer was unavailable. Bill set the phone down and stared at his hands. They were scarred and calloused and spotted with age. Hands that had held rifles and babies and his wife's hand as she died. Hands that had signed papers trusting blood to honor blood. Doc came back inside 20 minutes later, her expression cautiously optimistic. "I talked to Nora Blackwood. She's a lawyer who specializes in elder law. She said she'll meet with you tomorrow, no charge for the consultation. She thinks you might have a case." Bill nodded his thanks but didn't feel hopeful. Cases took time, and he had 30 days. Mathematics didn't care about justice. They talked for another hour, Doc trying to problem solve and Bill appreciating the effort while knowing that some problems didn't have solutions, only different versions of defeat. She left at 10 with promises to check in tomorrow and offers of her couch if things got desperate. Bill locked the door behind her and stood in the center of his trailer, this metal box that had contained the aftermath of his life after Patricia died, and the house had to be sold to pay medical bills. He should sleep, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, he moved to the bedroom and pulled his old footlocker from under the bed. It was battered green metal with his name stenciled on the side in white paint, a companion through 4 decades of service. Inside were the layers of a life lived in uniform. His dress blues, preserved in plastic. Medals in a case, bronze and silver tokens of moments when doing the right thing had almost cost him everything. Photographs of men he'd served with, some alive and some whose names were carved into black granite in Washington. At the bottom, wrapped in a cloth that had once been part of Patricia's wedding dress, was his service pistol, Colt 19.45 caliber, the same model his father had carried in Korea. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of steel and history and decisions not yet made. The gun was unloaded, ammunition stored separately because safety was a habit that transcended civilian life. But holding it brought a kind of clarity. He could end this. End the struggle and the betrayal and the slow grinding diminishment of aging in a country that venerated youth and discarded experience. One bullet would solve the problem of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. It would be easy, easier than fighting his own children in court, easier than facing homelessness at 72, easier than living with the knowledge that the people he'd loved most had seen him only as an obstacle to wealth. But Patricia's voice echoed in memory, that last request made from a hospice bed. "Promise me you won't die alone like Jim." And beneath it, deeper, the voice of every soldier he'd ever led. Men who'd trusted him to get them home, and mostly he had. Suicide was breaking faith with the dead and the living both, was surrendering ground to an enemy that didn't deserve victory. Bill wrapped the pistol carefully and returned it to the footlocker, closing the lid on temptation and despair. He stood and walked back to the living room, to the window that looked out on a world going dark. Somewhere in that darkness were his children, sleeping peacefully in beds paid for with his stolen money, untroubled by conscience or consequence. And somewhere else in that darkness was Jim's memory, his twin brother who died 6 months ago, according to the funeral notice Bill had seen in the paper, a notice that mentioned services and survivors, but not the 40 years of silence between brothers who'd chosen different paths. Bill had not attended the funeral. Pride, stubbornness, the same qualities that had sustained him through wars and loss now keeping him from closure. He wondered if Jim had died alone, like Patricia feared. Wondered if his brother's final thoughts had included regret, or if men who built empires had no room for softer emotions. He returned to his recliner and sat in darkness, not bothering with lights because darkness cost nothing and matched his mood. Sleep came eventually, fitful and populated with dreams of Patricia young and laughing, of Jim as a boy before money divided them, of his children small enough to believe their father was a hero. He woke to hammering on his door, harsh and insistent. Dawn light filtered through the window. His phone showed 6:30 in the morning, and he'd slept in his clothes, something he hadn't done since field deployments. The hammering continued. Bill stood stiffly and opened the door to find the park manager, a weary-looking man named Peters who owned a dozen trailer parks across the county and managed them all with the enthusiasm of someone trapped in a job that paid bills but killed souls. "Mr. Thornton," Peters said, his voice carrying the flat affect of a man delivering bad news he'd delivered too many times. "I need to talk to you about your rent situation." "I got the notice," Bill said. "I have 30 days. Peters shifted uncomfortably. "The thing is, Mr. Thornton, the 30-day clock started 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to reach you. You have 1 week left." Bill processed this information with the calm of a man whose capacity for shock had reached its limit. 1 week, 7 days to find a new place to live with $212 and no prospect of more. "I understand," Bill said, because what else was there to say? Peters looked relieved that there would be no confrontation, no scene. He handed Bill another envelope. "This is just the formal notification. I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton, you've been a good tenant if circumstances were different. But circumstances weren't different, and apologies didn't create housing or restore stolen money or fix the fundamental truth that 72-year-old veterans evicted from trailer parks had very few places left to fall." Peters left, and Bill stood in the doorway watching the sun rise on what might be his last week in the only home he'd known since Patricia died. The cold air made his eyes water, or maybe it wasn't the cold. He closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of years and betrayal and impossible mathematics. His phone rang. Doc Martinez. "Bill," she said without preamble, "how fast can you get to my office? Something's come up." "What kind of something?" "The kind you need to see in person." 30 minutes? Bill agreed and ended the call. He showered quickly, shaved, dressed in clean clothes because habits persisted even when everything else failed. He climbed into his truck and drove through a morning that looked no different than any other morning, but felt like the edge of something he couldn't yet see or name. Doc's office occupied the ground floor of an old building on Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store that had survived the death of downtown and a coffee shop that catered to the 3 tourists who wandered through town each summer. The waiting room was empty, early enough that patients hadn't yet arrived with their ailments and insurance cards. Doc met him at the door and ushered him into her office, a small space made smaller by filing cabinets and medical equipment and the accumulated paperwork of treating people who couldn't afford to be sick. She closed the door and handed him a manila envelope, thick and official-looking. "This came to my office yesterday afternoon," she said. "Forwarded from some law firm in Wyoming. It's addressed to you." Bill took the envelope and examined the return address. Reading and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Jackson, Wyoming. He didn't know any lawyers in Jackson, didn't know anyone in Jackson at all. He opened the envelope and pulled out a sheaf of papers, legal documents dense with formal language and signatures. The cover letter was addressed to him and dated 6 months ago. "Dear Mr. William Thornton, this is to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary of the estate of James William Thornton, deceased. As the executor of Mr. Thornton's will, I am required by law to notify you of this inheritance. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience to discuss the details and begin the transfer process." The letter was signed by someone named Roy Blackwood, attorney. Bill read the letter twice, then a third time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. James William Thornton. Jim. His brother. The brother he hadn't spoken to in 40 years, hadn't reconciled with, hadn't said goodbye to. He looked up at Doc, who was watching him with the careful attention of someone monitoring a patient for shock symptoms. "Your brother?" she said softly. Bill nodded, unable to speak past the knot forming in his throat. Jim had left him something. After 40 years of silence, after decades of choosing empire over family, Jim had remembered Bill at the end. He flipped through the other documents. Estate inventory, property deeds, stock certificates. The numbers swam on the page, too large to be real, too official to be fake. Doc leaned forward. "Bill, do you understand what this says?" Bill shook his head because understanding required processing, and processing required a mind not currently occupied with memories of 2 boys who dreamed together and fought together and ultimately couldn't find their way back to each other across the distance of their choices. "It says your brother left you everything," Doc said. "The ranch, the land, the investments. Bill, according to this, you just inherited close to $500 million. The words existed in space but couldn't penetrate the wall of disbelief that protected Bill from truths too large to hold. $500 million. The same brother who'd mocked his choice to serve rather than build, who'd called honor a luxury poor men couldn't afford, who'd cut contacts so completely that Bill had learned of his death from a newspaper obituary. Why? Bill heard himself ask, the question directed at ghosts and silence. Doc shook her head. I don't know. But Bill, this changes everything. Your eviction, your stolen money, your kids, this changes all of it. Bill set the papers down on Doc's desk and stood, needing movement, needing air, needing something his body could do, while his mind tried to catch up to a reality that had shifted beneath his feet like an earthquake reshaping continents. I need to call them, he said. This law firm, I need to understand. Doc handed him her phone and the letter with the number. Bill dialed with hands that had steadied, muscle memory from 1,000 tense situations, teaching his body how to function when his mind was chaos. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Reading and Associates. My name is William Thornton, Bill said. I received a letter regarding my brother's estate. There was a pause, typing. Then the woman's voice warmed. Mr. Thornton, we've been trying to reach you for months. Please hold while I connect you to Mr. Blackwood. Bill waited, listening to silence interrupted by periodic clicks as the call was transferred. Then a man's voice, rough and weathered like old leather. Colonel Thornton, Roy Blackwood here. I was beginning to think you'd never call. I just received the letter, Bill said. It was forwarded to my doctor's office. Forwarded, Blackwood repeated. Well, that explains the delay. Colonel, we need to meet in person. There are things about your brother's will that I need to explain face to face. How soon can you get to Jackson? Bill thought about his eviction notice, his empty bank account, his truck that needed $200 in repairs he couldn't afford. I can be there tomorrow. Tomorrow's good. My office at noon. The address is in the letterhead. Colonel, there's one more thing you should know before you make the trip. What's that? Your brother left very specific instructions about this inheritance. He knew you'd have questions. He knew there might be challenges. He prepared for that. Everything you need to understand what he built and why he left it to you, it's waiting here, in the ranch office. Ranch office, Bill repeated, the words foreign in a conversation about a brother who'd become a stranger. Devil's Canyon Ranch, Blackwood said. 340 acres of prime Wyoming land. That's your inheritance, Colonel. The land, the house, the mineral rights, and everything in between. Your brother wanted you to have it all. He wanted you to know he never forgot you, even when silence made it seem like he had. Bill closed his eyes and saw Jim, as he'd been at 18, standing in the doorway of their father's ranch house, facing a choice between family tradition and military service. Bill had chosen the uniform and Jim had stayed behind, and that choice had echoed through 4 decades like a gunshot in a canyon, the sound never quite fading. I'll be there tomorrow, Bill said, and ended the call. He handed the phone back to Doc and stood in her office with papers that claimed he was rich and memories that said he'd lost everything that mattered. The two truths existed simultaneously, incompatible but undeniable. You should go, Doc said gently. Take the truck, drive to Jackson, see what this is. Bill, this might be Jim's way of saying what he couldn't say when he was alive. Bill nodded because speech required organization of thoughts too scattered to gather. He walked out of Doc's office into morning light that seemed different somehow, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. His phone buzzed, a text message from a number he didn't recognize. Dad, it's Rebecca. We heard about Uncle Jim's estate. We need to talk. This is a family matter and we should handle it together. Call me. Bill stared at the message, at the carefully chosen words that sounded like concern but tasted like strategy. They'd stolen his money and evicted him and disappeared when he needed them. But now that inheritance loomed, they remembered they had a father. He deleted the message without responding and climbed into his truck. The engine started after 3 pumps of the gas pedal, reliable in its dysfunction. Bill pulled out of the parking lot and drove not toward the trailer park, but toward the highway, toward Jackson, toward a brother's final gesture, and whatever truth or trap waited in the shadow of mountains and the silence of 40 years. The landscape opened up as he drove, Wyoming spreading vast and indifferent under a sky too big for human problems. Bill drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and his mind on Patricia's last request. Don't die alone. And Jim's apparent final wish. Come home. Maybe they were the same thing. Maybe inheritance wasn't just property and money, but a chance to close circles left open too long. Or maybe it was another betrayal waiting to happen, another trust that would be broken because broken was what happened to men fool enough to believe in blood and family. Bill drove toward the answer, toward Devil's Canyon Ranch and whatever his brother had left behind, driven by the stubborn refusal to surrender that had sustained him through wars and wounds and losses too numerous to count. His children might have stolen his past, but Jim had apparently left him a future, and Bill Thornton was still marine enough to face whatever came next with his eyes open and his spine straight, ready for battle or benediction or whatever waited at the end of roads that led through silence, back to something that might, if he was very lucky or very cursed, feel like home. The drive to Jackson took 4 hours through landscape that seemed designed to remind men of their insignificance. Bill watched Wyoming unfold through the windshield of his failing truck, mountains rising like ancient sentinels guarding secrets older than nations. The road cut through valleys where ranches sprawled across acres that made his trailer park lot feel like a postage stamp, fences stretching toward horizons that never seemed to arrive. Cattle grazed in fields brown with winter dormancy, their breath visible in air cold enough to make the truck's heater work overtime just to maintain tepid. He'd left at dawn without telling anyone except Doc Martinez, who'd appeared at his trailer with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in foil, her way of saying goodbye without making it feel like goodbye. The coffee was gone now, the thermos empty on the passenger seat beside a road atlas from 1998 that showed Jackson as a small dot in the northwest corner of the state. Bill didn't trust GPS, didn't trust technology that could track his movements and report his location to satellites and servers owned by people who viewed privacy as a commodity to be harvested. The radio played country music from a station that faded in and out as the terrain shifted, songs about trucks and heartbreak and small towns that felt like eulogies for a version of America that might have never existed or might have died while no one was watching. Bill turned it off and drove in silence, preferring the sound of the engine's labor and the wind pushing against the truck's broad face. He thought about Jim. Couldn't help but think about Jim. 40 years of silence didn't erase 50 years of shared history, didn't delete the memories of two boys who'd been born minutes apart and spent their childhood finishing each other's sentences. They'd learned to ride horses on their father's ranch, competing to see who could stay mounted longer when the broncs bucked and twisted beneath them. They'd fought the same bullies in the same one-room schoolhouse, standing back to back the way their father taught them. Thorntons don't run, and Thorntons don't fight alone. The split had come slowly and then all at once, the way fractures propagate through stressed metal. Bill had enlisted in 1970 when the draft was breathing down both their necks, choosing to serve rather than wait to be called. Jim had stayed, taking advantage of the family farm exemption that kept essential agricultural workers stateside. Their father had died in 1972, heart attack while mending fence, and the ranch became Jim's inheritance by default since Bill was in the jungle learning that courage and luck were different currencies and only one kept you alive. Bill had come home on leave for the funeral, wearing his dress uniform because he owned nothing else fit for mourning. Jim had been there in a suit that looked expensive, even to eyes that didn't know fabric from canvas. They'd stood on opposite sides of their father's grave, the casket between them like a border neither could cross. After the service, Jim had made his offer. "Stay," Jim had said. "Partner with me. We'll build this place into something Dad never dreamed." Bill had looked at the ranch, at the 160 acres their grandfather had homesteaded and their father had maintained through depression and war and drought. It was good land, honest land, the kind that rewarded work and punished laziness with the impartial justice of seasons and weather. "I signed a contract," Bill had said. 4 more years. Contracts can be broken. Medical discharge. Hardship. I can make it happen. Bill had felt something shift in that moment, a recognition that his brother saw rules as suggestions and obligations as negotiable. The military had taught him different lessons, that your word was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you, and breaking it meant losing the part of yourself that mattered most. "I gave my word," Bill said. "To who? The government? They'll chew you up and spit you out, Billy. This ranch, this is real, this is ours." "My word is real." Jim's face had hardened then, the expression of a man calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. "Suit yourself, play soldier. When you come back, there won't be anything left to come back to." It hadn't been a threat, it had been a prediction, and like most of Jim's predictions, it had proven accurate. Bill had returned from Vietnam in 1975 to find the ranch sold, the land subdivided, Jim living in Cheyenne running an oil and gas consulting firm that was making the kind of money that turned hundreds into thousands into millions. They'd met once more briefly at a restaurant where Jim had offered Bill a job. "Work for me, I need someone I can trust. I don't know anything about oil and gas. You know how to lead men. That's all management is." Bill had looked at his brother across a table in a restaurant, nicer than any place he'd ever eaten, seeing a stranger wearing his twin's face. The Jim he'd known had valued handshakes and hard work. This new version valued leverage and opportunity and seemed to think money could purchase anything, including forgiveness for selling their father's legacy to developers who turned rangeland into strip malls. "I can't work for you," Bill had said. "Why not?" "Because you became what I spent 4 years fighting against. Greed wearing a flag." Jim had stood then, throwing cash on the table like it meant nothing because to him it didn't. "You're a self-righteous fool, Billy. Patricia deserves better than a jarhead's paycheck." Patricia married the jarhead. She knew what she was getting. "Then you're both fools." That had been 1985. 40 years of silence followed, broken only by Christmas cards Patricia sent that went unanswered and occasional news filtering through mutual acquaintances. Jim's business was booming. Jim bought a ranch. Jim was worth 10 million, 20 million, 100 million. The number stopped meaning anything beyond confirmation that the distance between brothers could be measured in dollars and the gap was unbridgeable. Bill had tried not to care, had mostly succeeded. Patricia had been enough. Their 3 children had been enough. The modest life they'd built through his military pension and her work as a school librarian had been enough. Until it wasn't, until the children grew up in a way and Patricia got sick and died, and Bill found himself alone in a trailer park wondering if Jim had been right all along, if loyalty was just another word for stupidity. And now Jim was dead and had left everything to the self-righteous fool who'd chosen honor over fortune. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The truck crested a rise and Jackson spread below, a town that had grown from western outpost to vacation destination, ski resorts and art galleries coexisting uneasily with feed stores and saddle shops. Bill found the address from the letterhead, a small office building on a side street away from the tourist core. He parked and sat for a moment, gathering himself the way he'd done before patrols and assaults, acknowledging fear without surrendering to it. The office of Reading and Associates occupied the second floor, accessible via stairs that creaked under his weight. The door was frosted glass with the firm name in gold letters that needed repainting. Bill pushed it open and entered a waiting room that looked like every lawyer's office he'd ever seen. Leather chairs and law books and the smell of old paper and older secrets. A woman sat behind the desk, Native American with silver hair pulled back and eyes that assessed him with the quickness of someone used to reading situations. She stood and extended her hand. "Colonel Thornton, I'm Margaret. Mr. Blackwood is expecting you." Bill shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip. She led him down a short hallway to an office where a man sat behind a desk covered in files and photographs. The man stood, and Bill felt recognition slam into him like a physical blow. Roy Blackwood was Native American, Shoshone if Bill had to guess, but that wasn't what stopped his breath. What stopped his breath was that Roy Blackwood looked exactly like someone who'd spent 40 years working a ranch, weathered and lean, with hands scarred by wire and rope, and the thousand small violences of keeping land productive. He looked, in other words, like Jim should have looked. Like the brother Bill remembered before money changed everything. "Colonel Thornton," Roy said, his voice carrying the gravel of a lifetime of Wyoming wind. "Thank you for coming." They shook hands, and Bill took the offered chair, old leather that creaked like the stairs. Roy settled back behind his desk and studied Bill with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "You look just like him," Roy said. "It's unsettling. We were twins." "I know. He talked about you every damn day for 40 years. The words hit harder than Bill expected. Every day. 40 years of silence on Bill's end. 40 years of Jim talking about the brother he'd lost to principles and pride. "What did he say?" Roy leaned back, the chair protesting. "At first, after you two split, he was angry. Called you stubborn, self-destructive, too proud for your own good. But that changed over time. Last 20 years, all he talked about was regret. How he'd been wrong. How he'd valued the wrong things. How he wished he could take it back but didn't know how." Bill felt something tight in his chest, grief mixed with anger, mixed with the particular pain of knowing reconciliation had been possible, and neither of them had been brave enough to reach for it. Why didn't he call? Bill asked. Why didn't he write? Pride, Roy said simply. Same reason you didn't. You Thornton men, you'd rather die than admit you were wrong. Well, Jim died, and his last chance to tell you he was sorry came in the form of legal documents and property transfer. Roy pulled a folder from his desk and opened it, revealing papers Bill couldn't read from his position. This is Jim's will. It's simple and it's ironclad. Everything goes to you. The ranch, the investments, the mineral rights, the bank accounts, total value as of his death 6 months ago was $483 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. Bill had known from the letter that it was substantial, but hearing it spoken made it real in a way that paper couldn't convey. Why, Bill asked, the only question that mattered. Roy pulled out another document. This one a letter in an envelope with Bill's name written in handwriting he recognized despite 4 decades. Jim's handwriting, the same careful script they'd both learned in that one-room schoolhouse. He left this for you, Roy said, sliding the envelope across the desk. He made me promise to give it to you in person. Said you'd have questions and he wanted to answer them himself, even if he had to do it from the grave. Bill took the envelope with hands that wanted to shake but remembered discipline. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind Jim would have used for important documents. Bill opened it carefully and unfolded 3 pages of dense text. Billy, the letter began, and just seeing that nickname in Jim's hand broke something in Bill's chest that he'd thought was already broken beyond further damage. If you're reading this, I'm dead and you're probably angry. Angry, I left you everything. Angry, I never called. Angry, I was too proud and too stubborn and too stupid to fix what I broke between us. You have every right to that anger. I earned it. I'm not going to waste your time with excuses. The ranch, the money, the empire I built, none of it means a damn thing. I figured that out too late, the way men like us usually do. You chose honor over wealth. You chose Patricia over profit. You raised your kids on a sergeant's pay and never complained. I chose money over everything and ended up with everything except what mattered. I'm alone, Billy, dying alone in this big house I built to prove something to people who don't care and never did. No wife because I was married to work. No kids because kids require time and love, and I had neither to spare. No friends because I didn't trust anyone who wasn't useful, and usefulness isn't the foundation of friendship. But I watched you, hired investigators. I'm not proud of it, but I needed to know you were okay. I watched you serve your country with distinction. Watched you marry Patricia and build a family. Watched you struggle when money was tight, but never compromise. Never take shortcuts. Never become what I became. And I watched your kids, Jackson, Rebecca, Kyle. I watched them from the time they were born, and Billy, I'm sorry, but they're not all like you. 2 of them are like me, greedy, manipulative, willing to hurt people to get what they want. But Kyle, Billy, there's something different about him. I've watched him wrestle with conscience in ways the other 2 never have. He's made terrible choices, yes, but I've seen moments when he almost chose differently. Almost. I have evidence, Billy, 40 years of evidence. It's all in the ranch office, in the safe. Combination is Patricia's birthday, 051843. Your children are planning to destroy you. Jackson and Rebecca have been planning it for years. Kyle got pulled into their schemes, but the investigators' reports show he's conflicted in ways they're not. I have recordings, bank records, communications, everything you need to stop them. Because they're going to come for this inheritance, Billy. They're going to claim you're not competent, that you need guardianship, that you can't manage this kind of wealth. Don't let them. The ranch is yours because you're the only person I trust to protect it. Not for money, you never cared about money. But because it's land, Billy, it's what we came from. It's what matters when everything else burns away. Keep it wild. Keep it honest. Don't let them turn it into profit margins and quarterly reports. I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother. I'm sorry I chose wrong and stuck with wrong because admitting error felt like weakness. You were always the stronger one, Billy. Strong enough to be gentle, strong enough to be kind, strong enough to be a poor when being rich just required selling pieces of your soul. I didn't think mattered until there was nothing left to sell. Watch Kyle carefully. He's not innocent, but he's not beyond redemption either. Sometimes the ones who fall the hardest are the ones who can climb back highest. I don't know if he'll choose right when the moment comes, but give him the chance to surprise you. I love you, brother. I always did, even when I was too stupid to say it. Semper Fi. Jim. Bill read the letter twice, then a third time, waiting for the words to stop meaning what they meant. Jim had watched him for 40 years, had known about the kids, had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous planning he'd applied to building an empire. And he'd seen something in Kyle that Bill had missed. Some flicker of conscience buried beneath bad choices. The evidence, Bill said, his voice rough. In the ranch office. You've seen it? Roy nodded. Jim showed me some of it. Your son Jackson is a cocaine addict and embezzler. Your daughter Rebecca likely murdered her first husband for insurance money. Your son Kyle is corrupt, taking bribes from developers and politicians. But Jim was right about one thing. The reports on Kyle show hesitation. Moments where he almost backed out. Almost called you to warn you, almost chose differently. He didn't, in the end, but the struggle was there. Bill closed his eyes and saw his children as they'd been, small and trusting, and convinced their father was a hero. Somewhere between then and now, they'd learned different lessons. But maybe, just maybe, one of them still remembered what it felt like to believe in something beyond self-interest. How long have you known, Bill asked, about the inheritance or the kids? Both. Jim made this will 5 years ago, updated it every year to make sure it was legally bulletproof. As for your kids, I've known what they are for about as long. Jim used to show me the investigators' reports. I think it made him feel less alone, knowing someone else understood the choice he'd made to leave everything to you. And he always wondered about Kyle, always hoped that one might find his way back. Bill stood and walked to the window, looking out at Jackson, at mountains beyond the town, at wilderness that didn't care about human drama and inherited wealth and broken families. He thought about Patricia, about her last words asking him not to die alone. She'd meant it as a plea for him to stay connected to the children. But maybe she'd known something he hadn't. Maybe she'd seen what Jim had seen and tried to warn him in her gentle way. When can I see the ranch? Bill asked. Now, if you want. I can drive you out there. It's about 2 hours. Bill nodded and turned from the window. Let's go. They took Roy's truck, a new Ford diesel that rode smooth and quiet, so different from Bill's failing vehicle that it felt like traveling in different centuries. Roy drove with the easy confidence of a man who knew these roads in all seasons and all weather. They left Jackson heading east, the highway climbing into mountains before descending into valleys that seemed untouched by time. Roy talked as he drove, filling silence with information Bill needed but didn't want. The ranch was 340 acres, prime grazing land with water rights that made it worth more than comparable properties. Jim had bought it 15 years ago, restored the original homestead buildings, built a main house that was comfortable without being ostentatious. He'd lived there alone, refusing staff except for Roy, who managed the operation, and visited daily to check on the man who'd become his employer and eventually his friend. Jim was a good man, Roy said. Complicated, driven, made mistakes he couldn't unmake. But at the core, he was good. I want you to know that, and he believed in second chances even when people didn't deserve them. That's why he never gave up on Kyle completely. Bill absorbed this, adding another layer to his understanding of a brother who died before they could talk and now communicated through lawyers and bank statements and 40 years of surveillance that proved love could survive alongside silence. The ranch appeared as the road crested a final rise. Devil's Canyon spread below, a valley carved by water and time into something that looked designed rather than accidental. The main house was log construction, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Barns and outbuildings dotted the property, all maintained to standards that spoke of care and resources. Fences ran straight and true, marking boundaries that meant something to lawyers and nothing to the elk Bill could see grazing in a far pasture. Roy pulled up to the main house and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk hunting thermals. Bill climbed out and stood looking at what his brother had built, trying to reconcile the opulence with memories of the modest ranch where they'd grown up. Come on, Roy said, let me show you inside. The front door was unlocked, opening into a great room with cathedral ceilings and windows that framed the mountains like living paintings. The furniture was leather and wood, masculine and functional, built for comfort rather than display. Photographs lined one wall and Bill moved toward them, drawn by the pull of memory. The photos showed Jim at various ages, always alone or with men in business suits, never with family or friends in the way normal people documented their lives. But scattered among the professional photos were others, older ones in frames that looked handled and cherished. Bill and Jim as children, sitting on horses too large for them. Their father, stern and weathered, standing between his sons with hands on their shoulders. And one photo that made Bill's breath catch, his wedding day, him in his dress blues, and Patricia in her simple white dress, both of them young and hopeful and unaware of what 50 years would cost. He kept this, Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept everything about you, Roy said from behind him. Newspaper clippings when you got promoted, copies of your commendations. He had a whole file cabinet of your life, Billy. He never stopped caring. He just didn't know how to show it in ways that mattered. Bill touched the wedding photo, his finger leaving a print on glass that someone, probably Roy, had kept clean and dust-free. Patricia smiled at him from 49 years in the past, her whole life ahead of her. Good years and hard years and final years she'd faced with a grace Bill couldn't match. "Show me the office," Bill said. "Show me what Jim left." Roy led him through the house to a room on the first floor that served as an office and library. One wall was floor-to-ceiling books, leather-bound volumes mixed with paperbacks, histories and biographies, and technical manuals about geology and drilling and mineral extraction. The desk was mahogany, the chair, leather, everything chosen for durability rather than fashion. Behind a painting of Devil's Canyon at sunset, Roy revealed a wall safe, industrial grade, with a digital keypad. He stepped back and gestured for Bill to open it. Bill punched in the numbers. 051843. Patricia's birthday, May 18th, 1943. The safe beeped and locks disengaged with the solid thunk of precision engineering. Bill pulled the heavy door open and found himself looking at the systematic documentation of 40 years of surveillance. 6 USB drives sat in foam cutouts, each labeled with years. Beside them were file folders, bank records, legal documents, and a small video camera that looked professional grade. Bill reached for the first USB drive, labeled 1985 to 1995, but Roy stopped him. "Maybe you should sit down for this," Roy said gently. Jim was thorough. "What you're about to see, it's going to hurt." Bill sat in the desk chair, and Roy produced a laptop from a drawer, connecting the USB drive and opening files that represented a decade of his life seen through his brother's eyes. Video files, audio recordings, photographs, documents, all organized with the precision of a military operation. The first video was dated December 1985. Bill clicked play and watched his son Jackson, 7 years old, caught on what looked like a hidden camera in a store. The boy was stealing, slipping a candy bar into his pocket with the casual skill of someone who had done it before. Bill watched himself from 40 years ago, younger and harder, discovering the theft and marching Jackson back into the store to confess and pay. The video had audio, and Bill heard his own voice, stern and disappointed. "Thorntons don't steal, son. We don't take what isn't ours." Young Jackson had cried and apologized and promised never to do it again. The video ended, but the file contained more footage, showing Jackson stealing again a week later and again a month after that. Bill clicked through more files, his heart sinking with each discovery. Rebecca at 10, manipulating other children with tears and lies. Then something different. A video of Kyle at 12 caught cheating on a test. But unlike his siblings, Kyle's face showed something the others lacked. Shame. Real shame. The investigator's notes confirmed it. Subject Kyle displayed remorse. Attempted to confess to teacher, but was talked out of it by subject Jackson. Pattern suggests conflicted conscience. Bill worked through the USBS methodically, watching decades of proof that 2 of his children had been practicing betrayal their entire lives. But Kyle's files were different. Yes, there was evidence of wrongdoing, but there were also moments of hesitation, of almost choosing right. A note from 2015. Subject Kyle contacted father's phone but disconnected before it rang. 7th attempt this month, a video from 2018, Kyle arguing with Jackson, saying their parents deserve better, before being convinced otherwise. The pattern was clear. Jackson led, Rebecca supported, and Kyle followed reluctantly, always conflicted, never quite brave enough to break away, but never quite comfortable with the cruelty either. The final USB contained the most recent surveillance, video of Jackson meeting with loan sharks, audio of Rebecca discussing murder, and Kyle alone in his office, head in his hands, a recording capturing his whispered words. "I can't keep doing this. They're my parents. This is wrong." But he'd done it anyway. weakness masquerading as loyalty to siblings who'd never deserved it. Bill sat motionless when the videos ended, staring at a screen gone black. Two of his children were monsters. One was a coward who knew right from wrong but lacked the courage to choose right. Jim had been correct. Kyle wasn't beyond redemption, but redemption required choice. And Bill didn't know if his youngest son had it in him to finally, belatedly, choose correctly. Roy had left at some point, giving Bill privacy for his grief. Bill sat alone in his brother's office, surrounded by evidence of comprehensive failure as a father. He'd failed to see what his children were becoming. He'd failed his brother by letting pride keep them apart. He'd failed Patricia by surviving her only to prove her fears correct. His phone buzzed. A text message from Jackson. "Dad, this is getting ridiculous. Call me back. We need to discuss Uncle Jim's estate. As family, we have rights." Bill stared at the message, then deleted it without responding. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at land that stretched toward mountains. Somewhere out there, his children were planning their next move. Jackson and Rebecca would come with lawyers and lies. And Kyle would follow, conflicted but complicit, knowing it was wrong but doing it anyway. Unless Jim was right, unless Kyle could be reached, unless one of his children could still remember what it felt like to choose honor over expedience. Bill didn't know if that hope was wisdom or foolishness, but Jim had believed it enough to write it in his final letter. And Bill owed his brother enough to at least consider the possibility that one of his children might still be salvageable. The question was whether Kyle would choose redemption when the moment came, or whether he'd follow his siblings into the darkness they'd chosen long ago. Bill would find out soon enough. The war was coming, and every soldier had to choose which side they fought for, even the reluctant ones, especially the reluctant ones. He locked the safe and walked out into Wyoming evening, breathing air that tasted like distance and possibility. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and battles and his children's attempts to take what Jim had given him. But tonight he stood on land that was his, looking at mountains that had witnessed human drama for millennia and remained unchanged. He was ready for whatever came next. And somewhere in his heart, despite everything, he hoped Kyle was ready too. Ready to finally, belatedly, impossibly choose the right side of a war that would define them all. The first attack came through lawyers, which was how civilized people waged war in a country that had replaced honor duels with litigation. Bill received the papers on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about his job. The document was thick, bound in blue backing, filled with legal language that translated to a simple message. Your children believe you're incompetent, and they're asking a judge to give them control of your life. Bill read it, standing on the porch of the ranch house, morning coffee cooling in his hand while wind carried the scent of pine and distance. The petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship painted him as a tragic figure, a war hero broken by PTSD and age, unable to manage his own affairs and desperately in need of protection from predatory influences. The predatory influences were never named, but the implication was clear. Anyone who supported Bill's right to control his own inheritance was suspect, probably manipulating the confused old man for personal gain. The hearing was set for 18 days from now. 18 days to prove he was mentally competent, financially capable, and not being exploited by people who actually cared whether he lived or died. Bill folded the papers carefully and set them on the porch rail, watching the sun climb over mountains that had witnessed a million human dramas and remained unchanged by all of them. Roy found him there an hour later, still standing, still watching the light change as morning advanced toward afternoon. Roy didn't ask what Bill was thinking because some thoughts were private and some silences were better than conversation. He simply stood beside Bill, and together they watched the ranch wake up, cattle moving toward water, horses testing the fence line, the world continuing its ancient patterns regardless of legal battles and family betrayals. "We should call Nora," Roy said eventually. "She'll want to see those papers." Bill nodded and they went inside to the office where Jim had spent his final years building a case against children he'd never met but understood too well. Bill had spent the past week going through more of the USB drives, watching his children grow from troubled kids into criminal adults. But he kept returning to Kyle's files, looking for the pattern Jim had seen. The hesitation, the conflict, the moments when conscience almost won. Nora arrived by noon, driving a truck that suggested she spent more time on ranches than in courtrooms, despite the law degree and the expensive briefcase. She took the legal papers and read them with the speed of someone who'd seen this playbook before and knew every move 3 steps ahead. Standard stuff, she said, flipping through pages. Emergency guardianship based on alleged incompetence. They're claiming you can't manage your finances, make medical decisions, or live independently. They want full control within 30 days. All 3 children signed it. Bill absorbed this, even Kyle then. Nora's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, I've seen the surveillance footage. Your youngest son looks like someone being dragged to execution, not someone leading the charge. Doesn't make him innocent, but it makes him different. Different doesn't mean trustworthy, Bill said. No, Nora agreed, but it might mean reachable. If he's as conflicted as the evidence suggests, there might come a moment when he chooses differently. Jim seemed to think so. The question is whether we give him that chance or treat him like the enemy he's pretending to be. Bill considered this. What would giving him a chance look like? We proceed as planned, Nora said. Build our case, prepare our evidence. But we keep one door open, a way for Kyle to step through if he decides he's tired of following his siblings into hell. I've got a burner phone. If he wants to talk, wants to help, he can reach out. No promises, no deals until we hear what he has to say. But we give him the option. And if he doesn't take it, then we destroy him along with his brother and sister. But at least we gave him the choice. Bill nodded slowly. Do it. But Nora, if this is a trick, if he's trying to infiltrate our defense, I want to know immediately. I'll vet anything he provides, trust, but verify. That's the only way this works. They spent the morning going through defense strategy, medical evaluation by independent doctors who would test Bill's cognitive function and memory, psychological assessment to address the PTSD claims, financial review showing he understood the scope of his inheritance and had concrete plans for managing it, character witnesses from fellow veterans and community members who could testify to his competence and judgment. And then, Nora said, her smile turning predatory, we go on offense. We show the judge who your children really are. The theft of your pension, the forged documents, the planned exploitation. We make it clear that the only people questioning your competence are the ones who stole from you. Bill listened and approved and signed the documents she needed signed. The war was coming and he would fight it with everything he had. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if Kyle was sitting in an office in D.C., staring at legal papers he'd signed, wondering if there was still time to choose a different path. The news broke the next day. Local paper ran the story first, small-town journalism that couldn't resist the drama. Billionaire ranchers disputed Will Pitt's brother against nieces and nephews. The article was reasonably balanced, but online comments revealed what people thought. Half sympathized with Bill. The other half questioned why a recluse billionaire would leave everything to a brother he hadn't spoken to in 40 years. By evening, the story had gone regional, then national. Bill refused all interview requests, a decision Nora supported. Let them speculate. Mystery makes you sympathetic. But staying silent didn't mean staying still. Bill spent his days preparing for the hearing, meeting with doctors who tested his memory and reasoning, sitting through evaluations that asked about his childhood and his marriages and his feelings about mortality. He answered honestly because lying required energy he didn't want to waste, and the truth was sufficient. Jackson arrived first, alone, driving a rental car up the long driveway like he had every right to be there. Bill watched from the porch as his oldest son climbed out, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Bill's truck was worth. Jackson looked around at the property with appraising eyes, calculating value, reducing legacy to numbers. Bill didn't move from his position, coffee in hand, waiting for Jackson to come to him. His son approached slowly, perhaps sensing he was entering territory where his usual advantages didn't apply. Dad, Jackson said, stopping at the base of the porch steps, we need to talk. No, we don't. Jackson's face tightened, unused to refusal. Be reasonable. This inheritance, it's complicated. You don't understand the tax implications, the legal structures, the investment strategies required. I understand you stole my pension, Bill said, his voice flat. I understand you forged documents and left me to be evicted. I understand you planned this for years. Jackson had the decency to look uncomfortable. That was a mistake. We were trying to help and got overzealous. But this is different. This is family wealth. Grandfather's ranch, Uncle Jim's empire, it belongs to all of us. Jim left it to me. The will is clear. Wills can be contested, especially when there are questions about undue influence and competency. Bill set his coffee cup down carefully. You're going to lose, son. The will is ironclad. I'm competent. And the evidence of what you've done, what you are, it's going to come out in court. Every crime, every manipulation, every moment that proves you're exactly the kind of person Jim wanted to exclude. Jackson's expression hardened, fear transforming into anger. You're going to regret this. We have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, judges, connections. You're a broke old man living on charity. You can't win. Get off my land, Bill said quietly. Jackson started to respond, then seemed to recognize something in Bill's eyes that made words unnecessary. He turned and walked back to his car, movement stiff with suppressed rage. The rental kicked up dust as he accelerated away. Rebecca came next, 2 days later, bringing cameras and a performance. Bill watched from inside as a news van parked at the property line, kept from approaching by the locked gate. Rebecca stood before the camera in designer clothes and practiced grief, giving an interview that would air on the evening news. She talked about childhood memories that never happened, about a loving father who'd grown paranoid and isolated, about fear that strangers were manipulating him. The reporter asked gentle questions Rebecca answered with tears, painting family tragedy that would have been convincing if Bill hadn't spent 2 weeks watching surveillance of her, planning his destruction. The interview ended with Rebecca pleading for her father to get help, to let his family care for him, to recognize that fighting them only hurt himself. Bill turned off the television and sat in darkness, thinking about the 7-year-old who'd believed her father could fix anything. The third visitor was different. Kyle didn't come to the ranch, didn't give interviews, didn't make public statements. Instead, 3 days after Rebecca's performance, Bill's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Dad, Kyle's voice quiet, strained. Please don't hang up. Bill said nothing, waiting. I know you have no reason to trust me. I know I've given you every reason not to, but I need you to know something. I didn't want this. Any of this. Jackson and Rebecca, they've been planning it for years. I tried to talk them out of it. I failed. I'm weak. I've always been weak. Then why are you calling? Because I can't do this anymore. I can't watch them destroy you. I signed those guardianship papers because Jackson said if I didn't, they'd cut me out completely. I've been following them my whole life, always afraid to stand alone. But Uncle Jim's letter, Dad, Roy showed it to me. Jim knew. He knew I was weak, but he also thought I could be better. I don't know if that's true, but I want it to be. Bill's grip tightened on the phone. What are you asking for? A chance, not forgiveness. I don't deserve that, but a chance to do one right thing after a lifetime of wrong ones. I have information about Jackson's embezzlement, about Rebecca's plans, about Senator Calloway's involvement. I can help you fight them. I will help you fight them. Not for money, not for inheritance, just to prove to myself that I'm not completely lost. The silence stretched. Bill thought about Jim's letter, about second chances and redemption. He thought about Patricia, who'd always believed people could change if they wanted to badly enough. Why should I believe you? Bill asked. You shouldn't, Kyle said. I've given you no reason to trust me, but I'll prove it. However you want me to prove it. I'll take a polygraph. I'll give you access to my files. I'll testify against Jackson and Rebecca, if that's what it takes. I'm prepared to lose everything, Dad. My career, my reputation, probably my freedom. I've done things that deserve punishment, but before that happens, I want to help you. Please. Bill looked out the window at Wyoming wilderness, at land that didn't care about human drama or family dysfunction. He thought about soldiers he'd known who'd made terrible choices and found their way back to honor through sacrifice and service. Not many, but some. Call this number, Bill said, and gave him Nora's burner phone. She'll vet whatever you want to provide. No promises, no deals. If you're sincere, prove it. If you're not, you'll go down with your siblings. I understand, Kyle said. And Dad, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I'm sorry. Bill hung up without responding. Sorry was a word. Action would determine its meaning. He called Nora immediately and explained the conversation. She listened without interruption, then spoke with the careful precision of a lawyer calculating odds. It could be a trap. Could be Jackson and Rebecca using him to infiltrate our defense. Could be, Bill agreed. Or it could be what Jim hoped for. A coward finding courage too late but finding it. I'll take the meeting, Nora said. See what he has. If it's legitimate intelligence, we use it. If it's manipulation, we burn him. Either way, we'll know soon. The call came from Senator Dutch Calloway that same evening. Not to Bill, but to Roy, who'd been Jim's connection to Wyoming politics and business. Calloway's message was simple. The state needed Devil's Canyon Ranch for economic development. Eminent domain proceedings would begin immediately. Bill could sell voluntarily or fight and lose. Roy relayed the message with grim satisfaction. He's making his move. Guardianship was plan A, eminent domain is plan B. He's trying to squeeze you from both sides. Can he win? In court? No, eminent domain requires legitimate public use and just compensation. Fracking mineral rights for private profit isn't public use, but he can make it expensive and time-consuming. Tie you up in litigation for years, hoping you'll settle just to end it. Bill considered this. Let him file. We'll fight both battles simultaneously. I didn't survive Vietnam to surrender to a corrupt politician. The night attack came without warning on a moonless Thursday. Bill was reviewing documents in the ranch office when the perimeter alarm triggered. 3 figures in tactical gear moving through darkness toward the main house. Their approach coordinated and professional. Bill moved through the house with muscle memory, killing lights, positioning himself with angles on entry points. The shotgun was loaded, 5 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. Enough. The figures reached the porch and one produced a pry bar, working on the front door. Bill racked the shotgun, the distinctive sound freezing all 3 attackers. They recognized what that sound meant. The next sound would be buckshot at close range. They retreated in tactical formation, professional enough to withdraw under threat. Bill tracked them through windows as Roy's truck roared up the driveway, headlights catching the fleeing figures. Behind Roy came Sheriff Tom Brennan's patrol vehicle, light bar flashing. The attackers escaped into the trees, but they'd left enough evidence to confirm what Bill already knew. Someone had hired professionals to kill him or scare him into cardiac arrest. Either would accomplish the same goal. By dawn, 6 veterans had arrived at the ranch, all men Roy had called personally. They established perimeter defense, 2 on patrol at all times, cameras monitoring approaches, communication protocols. The ranch became a fortified position. Bill tried to sleep, but sleep felt like surrender. He sat on the porch watching his security team patrol, professional and alert, thinking about how far things had fallen. A week ago, he'd been broke. Now he was rich and under siege. The media coverage intensified after the attack leaked. Some outlets portrayed Bill as a victim. Others suggested he'd staged it for publicity. Rebecca gave another interview expressing horror that anyone would attack her father, implying this proved he needed family protection from the dangers his inheritance attracted. Then Nora called with news that shifted everything. Kyle came through, she said. He provided documents showing Jackson's embezzlement scheme, wire transfers, client names, amounts. Everything the FBI would need to build a case. He also provided recordings of meetings with Senator Calloway, discussing the ranch development plan. Video evidence of conspiracy. Is it legitimate? I had it authenticated by 3 independent experts. It's real. Kyle also provided something else, a recording from 6 months ago. Rebecca and Jackson discussing your eviction, laughing about it. Calloway joining the conversation, offering to help with the guardianship case in exchange for mineral rights. Kyle was there. He didn't participate, but he didn't stop it either. Until now, Bill said. Until now, Nora agreed. He's also willing to testify. Full immunity isn't on the table, but I might offer reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. Kyle knows he's going to prison, Bill. He's accepted that. He just wants to take his siblings down first. Wants to do one right thing before he faces consequences. Bill felt something complex and painful twist in his chest. One of his children had found courage. Too late to avoid punishment, but not too late to matter. Set up the meeting, Bill said. I need to look him in the eye. They met at a neutral location, a conference room in Nora's law office. Kyle arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept in days, his suit rumpled, his eyes carrying shadows that spoke of choices weighing heavier than he'd expected. He stood when Bill entered, started to extend his hand, then thought better of it. He sat back down, silent, waiting for judgment. Bill sat across the table and studied his youngest son. Kyle had Patricia's eyes and Bill's jawline, genetic lottery that meant nothing compared to the choices that defined character. Why now? Bill asked. Kyle's voice was rough. Because I'm tired, Dad. Tired of being afraid. Tired of following Jackson because I was too weak to stand alone. Tired of watching Rebecca manipulate everyone while I pretended not to see. Tired of being the coward Jim thought I might stop being. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. This is everything. Bank records proving Jackson embezzled $4.2 million. Evidence Rebecca increased her husband's life insurance before he died. Video of Calloway discussing illegal development deals. Audio of all three of us planning your destruction. It's all yours. And what do you want in return? Kyle smiled bitterly. Want? I want to go back 20 years and make different choices. I want to be someone you could be proud of. But we don't get those options. What I'll settle for is helping you win. Testifying against Jackson and Rebecca. Facing whatever prison time I deserve. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, someday understanding why it took me so long to do what I should have done from the beginning. Bill looked at the folder, at the evidence that would destroy his other two children. Evidence his youngest son was providing, despite knowing it would destroy him too. Jim believed you could change, Bill said. I didn't. Prove me wrong. Kyle nodded, tears in his eyes. I will, Dad. I promise. Even if it's too late to matter, I'll prove him right. Nora returned with the district attorney, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crime. She reviewed the evidence Kyle provided, asked pointed questions, then made her offer. 18 months to 3 years, federal minimum security, full cooperation including testimony, disbarment, forfeiture of assets gained through illegal activity. You take the deal now or we proceed with full prosecution and you're looking at 8 to 10 years. Kyle didn't hesitate. I'll take it. They spent 4 hours documenting everything. Kyle provided passwords to encrypted files, named co-conspirators, drew diagrams of money flows, explained Senator Calloway's role in detail. By the time they finished, the DA had enough to prosecute a dozen people and destroy several political careers. Bill watched his son commit professional suicide with the methodical precision of someone who'd made peace with consequences. When it was over, Kyle stood and looked at his father one last time. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even ask for it. But thank you for giving me the chance to do this. It's the only decent thing I've done in years. He walked out flanked by federal agents who would ensure his cooperation, leaving Bill alone with Nora and the weight of what had just happened. One of them chose right, Nora said quietly. In the end, when it mattered, one of them chose right. That's not nothing, Bill. Bill nodded but couldn't speak. The grief was too fresh, too complicated. He'd lost a son to prison, but gained proof that redemption was possible, even for the weak. The trade felt both devastating and necessary. Over the following week, the machinery of justice engaged with ruthless efficiency. The FBI raided Jackson's office and home, seizing records that confirmed everything Kyle had provided. Rebecca was arrested at her home in Denver, charged with murder based on new evidence the district attorney's office had found using Kyle's intelligence as a roadmap. Senator Calloway resigned within hours of the FBI showing up at his office, fleeing the country before arrest warrants could be served. The guardianship hearing was still 9 days away, but the landscape had shifted. Bill's children were no longer concerned family members. They were criminal defendants facing decades in prison. And Kyle, the weak one who'd followed his siblings into darkness, had become the prosecution's star witness, the one who'd finally found courage to stand against the people who'd used his weakness against him. Bill sat on the ranch porch watching the sun set over Devil's Canyon, Roy beside him with 2 beers that tasted like victory and ash in equal measure. His family was destroyed. His children faced prison. But the ranch was secure, and the truth was coming to light, and one son had proven that choosing right was still possible, even when wrong seemed inevitable. Jim had been correct. Kyle wasn't beyond redemption. It had taken him 43 years to find his spine, but he'd found it when it mattered most. That had to count for something, even if the price was prison and disgrace and a father's complicated grief. The war wasn't over. The hearing was still coming, but Bill had won something more important than any legal battle. He'd proven that character could be built even from the wreckage of wasted years, that it was never too late to choose honor over expedience. That family could be defined by actions rather than blood. Kyle would go to prison, but he'd go as a man who'd finally, belatedly, impossibly done the right thing. And Bill would visit him there, not to forgive, not yet, but to acknowledge that the journey from coward to conscience, however late, however costly, was still a journey worth taking. That was legacy enough for a father who'd failed and a son who'd fallen but found his footing just in time to matter. The canyon stretched below, eternal and indifferent, and Bill felt something like peace settle over the pain of necessary choices. The courthouse in Jackson stood 3 stories tall, red brick and white columns, built in an era when civic architecture was meant to inspire respect for the law rather than mere efficiency. Bill climbed the steps at 8 in the morning, an hour before the hearing was scheduled to begin, flanked by Roy and Nora, and a growing sense that everything he'd survived in 72 years had been preparation for this moment. The gallery was filling fast, reporters and curious locals and people who'd driven hours to witness what the media was calling the trial of the decade. The story had everything people loved: wealth and betrayal, and an old soldier fighting his own children. But the story had shifted in the past week. Kyle's cooperation had transformed the narrative from concerned family versus confused elder to criminal conspiracy exposed by insider testimony. Nora had prepared Bill for what was coming. The guardianship hearing was now primarily focused on Jackson and Rebecca, though technically all 3 children remained petitioners. Kyle's cooperation agreement meant he would testify for the defense, would provide evidence against his siblings in exchange for reduced charges. Vincent Cross, the children's attorney, had tried to get the hearing postponed, claiming he needed time to adjust strategy. Judge Helen Martinez had denied the request. "If your clients are innocent," she'd said, "the truth shouldn't require additional preparation time." Judge Martinez entered at 9 sharp and the courtroom rose. She was 67 with steel gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen every trick lawyers could pull and wasn't impressed by any of them. Former Army JAG Corps, she had a reputation for cutting through pretense like a bayonet through canvas. She settled behind the bench and looked out at the crowded courtroom. "This is a guardianship hearing, not a circus. I'll maintain order or clear this room." "Understood?" Murmured agreement rippled through the gallery. Judge Martinez opened the file and began reading the petition. Jackson and Rebecca Thornton seeking emergency guardianship of their father, William Thornton, claiming he lacked capacity to manage his affairs. She looked up, and her eyes found Bill. "Colonel Thornton, you understand what your children are asking this court to do?" Bill stood, military courtesy making him rise when addressed by authority. "Yes, Your Honor. They're asking you to declare me incompetent and give them control of my life." "And how do you respond?" "I'm here to fight it, Your Honor. I'm of sound mind and capable of managing my own affairs." Judge Martinez nodded. "Then let's proceed. Mr. Cross, call your first witness." Vincent Cross stood, adjusting his expensive suit but looking less confident than he should. He'd lost a key client when Kyle flipped, and the remaining 2 were facing criminal charges that made defending a guardianship petition feel like rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. He called Jackson Thornton to the stand. Bill watched his oldest son take the oath, swearing to tell the truth while planning to do exactly the opposite. Jackson wore a dark suit and attempted somber concern, but fear leaked through the performance. He knew what was coming. He'd been arrested a week ago, released on bond, and now faced federal charges that could send him to prison for 20 years. This guardianship hearing was his last chance to gain some control over the inheritance he'd assumed would be his. Vincent Cross led him through familiar territory. When had Jackson last spoken to his father? How had Bill seemed? What concerns motivated this petition? Jackson answered smoothly, describing a paranoid father overwhelmed by sudden wealth, in need of family protection. "My father gave his life to this country," Jackson said, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. "He deserves to be cared for. That's all we want, to ensure his final years are comfortable." Bill listened to his son lie under oath and felt nothing but cold calculation. Jackson was good at this, but lies only worked until someone produced evidence of truth. Vincent Cross yielded the witness and Nora stood, moving toward Jackson with predatory precision. She didn't speak immediately, just studied him, letting silence build tension. "Mr. Thornton," Nora said finally, "when did you last see your father before filing this petition?" Jackson shifted slightly. "About 2 years ago." 2 years? And in those 2 years, how many times did you call him?" "I tried to call several times, but he didn't answer." Nora pulled phone records from her briefcase. "Can you point to any calls from your number?" Jackson looked at the document and his face tightened. He may have changed his number. "Did he, or did you simply never call?" "Let me ask a different question. On August 7th of last year, did you meet with your father at your office in New York?" Jackson hesitated. "I don't recall the specific date." "Let me refresh your memory. Your father drove 600 miles because you weren't returning calls. He wanted to know why his bank account was empty. Do you remember that meeting?" The courtroom was silent. everyone leaning forward. Jackson looked at Vincent Cross, but his attorney was reading documents with an expression suggesting he was realizing his clients had lied about several critical facts. I remember, Jackson admitted. What did you tell your father when he asked about his missing money? I told him it was in a trust, for his protection. And what else? Nora asked, her voice sharp. Did you tell him he was pathetic? That your mother died ashamed of him? I was upset. I may have said things I didn't mean. Nora pulled a recording device. Your father recorded that conversation. Would you like me to play it or admit you called your 72-year-old father pathetic and left him to sleep in his truck in a New York winter? The gallery erupted. Judge Martinez gavelled for silence, but her eyes were on Jackson with an expression that promised consequences. I was angry, Jackson said weakly, because he discovered you'd stolen $180,000 from his pension and savings accounts, money you transferred using forged power of attorney documents. Mr. Thornton, are you aware that forgery is a federal crime? Vincent Cross objected, but the damage was done. Nora produced bank records, forged documents, evidence that transformed Jackson from concerned son to criminal defendant. She showed cocaine purchases, embezzlement schemes, meetings with loan sharks. Each piece of evidence landed like a body blow. By the time Nora finished, Jackson was sweating and pale, his carefully constructed image shattered. He left the stand without looking at his father. Vincent Cross called Rebecca next, and Bill watched his daughter take the stand in a conservative dress and practiced sorrow. She testified about loving her father, about childhood memories, about concern for his welfare. Then Nora stood and the temperature dropped. Mrs. Sterling, how many times have you been married? Twice, Rebecca answered carefully. What happened to your first husband? He died. It was a terrible accident. He fell from a balcony, correct? Yes. How much life insurance did you collect? Rebecca's composure flickered. $3.2 million. And you doubled his policy 1 week before his death, hadn't you? Nora produced Maria Sanchez's sworn affidavit. The dying housekeeper's testimony was devastating. Describing the argument, the scream, Rebecca standing alone on the balcony practicing tears before police arrived. Miss Sanchez states she heard you push your husband. Is she lying? She's mistaken. She was old, confused. She passed a polygraph test. Would you be willing to take one today? Vincent Cross objected loudly, but the courtroom had already judged. Rebecca left the stand in tears, but they were tears of rage rather than sorrow. The afternoon session began with a surprise that transformed the entire proceeding. Nora called Kyle Thornton to the stand. The courtroom stirred with confusion and anticipation. Kyle walked to the witness box looking like a man who'd made peace with consequences. He wore a simple suit, no expensive accessories, no pretense. He took the oath and sat down, his eyes finding his father's for a brief moment before looking away. Mr. Thornton, Nora began, you're one of the petitioners in this guardianship case, correct? I was, Kyle said. I've since withdrawn my support for the petition. Why? Because it's based on lies. My father is completely competent. This petition was never about protecting him. It was about stealing from him. Vincent Cross shot to his feet. Your Honor, this witness is my client. I object to this entire line of questioning. Your client withdrew from your representation, Judge Martinez said. He's represented by separate counsel and has a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. You have no standing to object. Overruled, Nora continued. Mr. Thornton, tell the court about the planning that went into this guardianship petition. Kyle took a breath and began to speak, his voice steady despite visible emotion. My brother Jackson and sister Rebecca have been planning to exploit our father for at least 5 years. I have recordings, emails, and documents that prove they discussed getting power of attorney, draining his accounts, and forcing him into incompetency proceedings long before Uncle Jim died. And you participated in these discussions? Yes, Kyle said, shame evident in his voice. I went to meetings. I signed documents. I stood by while they stole from him. I didn't have the courage to stop them or warn him. I'm not here to claim innocence. I'm guilty of cowardice and complicity, but I'm here now to tell the truth. What changed? Kyle looked at Bill, Uncle Jim's letter. He left a message for my father, but Roy showed it to me. Jim had been watching us for 40 years. He knew what Jackson and Rebecca were, and he knew what I was, a coward who knew right from wrong, but was too weak to choose right. He said I wasn't beyond redemption. I didn't believe him, but I wanted to. And I realized that if I didn't act now, I never would. This was my last chance to be someone my father didn't have to be ashamed of. The courtroom was silent. Bill felt something painful and complicated twist in his chest. Grief and pride and regret tangled together in ways he couldn't separate. Nora walked Kyle through the evidence he'd provided. The embezzlement scheme, the murder evidence, the corruption with Senator Calloway. Kyle answered every question honestly, implicating himself along with his siblings, holding nothing back. Vincent Cross cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Kyle as a traitor seeking a better deal from prosecutors. But Kyle's answers were straightforward and damning. Yes, I made a deal. 18 months to 3 years in federal prison. Disbarment, forfeiture of assets, I'll lose everything. But I'll sleep better in prison than I ever did pretending to be a good person while enabling evil ones. Cross sat down, having accomplished nothing except highlighting the contrast between Kyle's honesty and his siblings' continued deception. Judge Martinez called for closing arguments, but the outcome was already clear. Vincent Cross stood and tried to salvage something, speaking about family and wealth management and good intentions gone wrong. But his words felt hollow. Nora's closing was brief and brutal. She recapped the evidence: the theft, the forgery, the murder, the conspiracy. She held nothing back. Jackson and Rebecca Thornton aren't concerned family members. They're criminals trying to complete a theft they started years ago. Kyle Thornton was complicit, but he had the courage to stop, to tell the truth, to face consequences. That's more than his siblings have shown. Colonel Thornton is mentally sharp, financially capable, and morally sound. The only people who think he needs guardianship are the people who want to rob him. The choice is simple. She sat down and the courtroom waited for Judge Martinez's decision. The judge looked at her notes, looked at Bill, looked at Jackson and Rebecca with expressions that could have frozen hell. I don't need time to deliberate, she began. I've presided over difficult cases in my 30 years on the bench. I've seen families torn apart by greed and grief, but I've rarely seen anything this clear-cut. She looked directly at Jackson and Rebecca. You two came into my courtroom claiming to be concerned children. What I've seen instead are criminals attempting to use the legal system to complete a theft. You stole from your father. You forged documents. You conspired with corrupt politicians. Evidence suggests one of you committed murder. Rebecca started to object, but Judge Martinez silenced her with a look. Colonel Thornton is one of the most competent people I've encountered in this courtroom. He served his country with distinction, survived heartbreak and betrayal, and faces his final years with dignity. He doesn't need your protection. He needs protection from you. The petition for guardianship is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney for criminal prosecution of Jackson and Rebecca Thornton. Mr. Cross, you will pay Colonel Thornton's legal fees. Your clients lied to you and to this court. She brought her gavel down with finality. We're adjourned. Bill sat motionless as chaos erupted. Reporters rushed for doors. Jackson and Rebecca were surrounded by cameras and shouted questions. Kyle sat alone at the defense table, head bowed, waiting for the federal marshals who would take him into custody. Nora grabbed Bill's arm. We won, completely. Bill nodded but couldn't speak. He'd won the legal battle, but the cost was written in his youngest son's face. A man who'd chosen redemption knowing it meant prison. Bill stood and walked to where Kyle sat. The courtroom was clearing, but a few people remained, witnesses to a moment that felt private despite public setting. Kyle looked up as Bill approached. Dad, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. Bill studied his son, seeing Patricia's eyes and his own jawline and 43 years of wasted potential. But he also saw something else now. Courage. Late but genuine. Jim was right about you, Bill said quietly. You're not beyond redemption. You're going to prison, son. You deserve that. But you did the right thing when it mattered most. That counts for something. Kyle's eyes filled with tears. Will you visit me? In prison? I don't expect forgiveness. Just maybe a chance to show you I can be better. Bill nodded slowly. I'll visit. Not because you've earned it, because that's what fathers do for sons who finally choose right. Federal marshals arrived and Kyle stood, accepting handcuffs without resistance. He looked at Bill one last time. Thank you, Dad, for giving me the chance. Bill watched his youngest son being led away to begin serving a sentence that would take years from his life, but might save what remained of his soul. It wasn't the ending Bill would have written, but it was better than the one that seemed inevitable just weeks ago. Roy appeared beside him. That took guts, talking to him after everything. He's still my son, Bill said. He made terrible choices, but he's trying to make better ones. That's more than the other two can say. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining, indifferent to human drama. Reporters swarmed, but Roy and Nora created a corridor for Bill to reach the truck. A reporter broke through and shoved a microphone toward him. "Colonel Thornton, how do you feel about your victory?" Bill looked at the camera. "I feel like a father who failed two children completely, but maybe didn't fail the third one as badly as I thought. The money, the ranch, the legal battle, none of it means anything compared to watching your son choose honor over expedience, even when that choice costs him everything." He walked down the steps to Roy's truck and climbed inside, leaving the reporters in spectacle behind. The drive back to Devil's Canyon was silent, both men processing what had happened in that courtroom. They'd won the battle. Jackson and Rebecca faced criminal trials that would likely send them to prison for decades. Kyle was already in custody, beginning a sentence that was lenient by comparison, but devastating nonetheless. The ranch was secure, the inheritance was protected. But the victory felt hollow in ways Bill couldn't quite articulate. He'd fought for justice and gotten it, but justice meant his children faced prison and his family was destroyed, and the only consolation was that one of them had found courage before it was too late. That night, Bill sat on the ranch porch with Roy, two beers that tasted like victory and ash in equal measure. "Kyle did good today," Roy said. "Took guts to testify against his siblings." Bill nodded. "Jim believed he could change. I didn't think it was possible. Shows what I know. You gave him the chance. That's all Jim asked for. Kyle took it, made different choices. That's on him, not you." Bill sipped his beer and watched stars emerge over mountains. One son in prison for doing the right thing. Two children heading to prison for doing wrong. A father who'd survived war and loss but felt hollowed out by family destruction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Criminal trials for Jackson and Rebecca. Media coverage of Kyle's cooperation. Building a foundation to honor Patricia's memory. But tonight, driving through Wyoming wilderness as sunset painted the mountains gold, Bill allowed himself a moment of complicated peace. He'd stood his ground. He'd fought for what mattered. He'd honored Jim's trust in Patricia's memory. And he'd given Kyle a chance at redemption, which Kyle had seized despite the cost. That had to be enough because it was all he had. The ranch spread below, eternal and indifferent, and Bill felt something like acceptance settle over the pain of necessary victories. The eminent domain hearing lasted 45 minutes. Senator Dutch Calloway had fled the country after the FBI raid, and the junior associate sent from the Attorney General's office spent most of the hearing apologizing for wasting the court's time. Judge Martinez dismissed the case with prejudice and added a comment for the record about government officials who abused power deserving prosecution to the fullest extent. Bill left that courthouse the same way he'd left the first one, feeling no triumph in victory, only exhaustion from battles that should never have been necessary. The media coverage was relentless for weeks. Bill's face appeared on news programs across the country, always the same photo from the courthouse steps, expressions suggesting he'd won something but lost more. The story had everything: the underdog veteran fighting corrupt family and politicians, justice prevailing against impossible odds. Interviewer requests came from morning shows and documentary filmmakers. Bill refused them all. His story wasn't entertainment, and his pain wasn't content for breakfast television. He retreated to Devil's Canyon Ranch and tried to remember what peace felt like. 6 months after the guardianship hearing, the criminal trials began. Jackson went first. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using Jim's surveillance footage, plus Kyle's testimony, plus additional evidence seized in raids. The jury deliberated 3 hours before convicting on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison, noting that Jackson had betrayed not just his clients, but the fundamental trust that made civilization possible. Bill didn't attend the sentencing. He learned about it from Roy, who'd followed the case and reported back with clinical detachment. Jackson was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking incongruous with the reality of his circumstances. He'd be 66 when released, if he survived prison that long. Rebecca's trial came 8 months later. Maria Sanchez had died before trial, her testimony preserved in deposition, but her physical presence lost to cancer. The defense argued hearsay and circumstantial evidence. But prosecutors had found other evidence, financial records showing Rebecca researched her husband's life insurance weeks before his death, internet searches about balcony accidents, a pattern suggesting planning rather than tragedy. The jury was out 2 days. The verdict was guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Rebecca to 25 years to life. She screamed when the sentence was read, her composure finally breaking, revealing rage and entitlement that had been hidden beneath practiced tears. She was 46. She'd be 71 at earliest release. Bill watched Rebecca's sentencing on the evening news, seeing his daughter led away in chains while reporters shouted questions. He turned off the television and sat in darkness, feeling something break inside that he hadn't known was still intact. Kyle had pleaded guilty 10 months after the guardianship hearing. His cooperation agreement meant 2 years in federal minimum security, disbarment, forfeiture of illegally gained assets. The judge acknowledged his assistance to prosecutors, noting that while Kyle had committed serious crimes, his decision to testify against co-conspirators and accept responsibility demonstrated the kind of character reform the justice system was meant to encourage. Bill attended that sentencing. He sat in the gallery and watched his youngest son stand before the judge and accept consequences with quiet dignity. "I have no excuses," Kyle told the court. "I knew right from wrong and chose wrong repeatedly. I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve a reduced sentence, but I want to be clear that I deserve more. What I did to my father, to his trust, to the people my siblings hurt because I was too cowardly to stop them, those crimes warrant punishment. I accept that. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the person my father deserved and my uncle believed I could be." The judge sentenced him to 2 years. Kyle turned and found Bill in the gallery. Their eyes met for a moment and Bill nodded once, acknowledgement without absolution. Kyle was led away to begin serving time, and Bill left the courthouse feeling the complicated grief of watching a son go to prison for finally doing right. The first year after the trials passed in a blur of legal aftermath and emotional processing. Doc Martinez visited often, checking Bill's physical and mental health, finding him damaged but functional, a man going through motions of living while learning how to feel alive again. "You can't blame yourself for all of it," she said one evening. "You raised them as best you could. They made their own choices." "2 of them made terrible choices," Bill said. "One of them made terrible choices and then chose differently. I don't know if that makes me a complete failure or just a partial one. It makes you human. And it makes Kyle someone who learned from his mistakes before it was too late. That's more than most people manage." Bill began visiting Kyle in prison 3 months into his sentence. The facility was in Colorado, minimum security that looked more like a college campus than a jail. They met in a visiting room with vending machines and plastic chairs, awkward at first, not knowing how to talk after decades of dysfunction. Kyle looked different. Prison had stripped away the lawyer polish, leaving someone who looked younger and more honest. They talked about small things initially, how Kyle was adjusting, what he was reading, plans for after release. Gradually, over months of visits, they talked about harder things. Kyle described the years of following Jackson, of knowing it was wrong but being too afraid to stand alone. Bill talked about failure as a father, about being deployed when the kids needed him, about prioritizing duty over family in ways that maybe created the distance his children filled with resentment. "I don't think it was your fault, Dad," Kyle said during one visit. "Jackson and Rebecca, they were who they were from early on. The surveillance footage Jim collected, you can see it. They chose cruelty when kindness was an option. That's not on you, that's on them." "And you?" Bill asked. "What's your excuse?" Kyle smiled sadly. "I was weak. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. I wanted to be brave like you, but I didn't have it in me. Until Uncle Jim's letter made me realize that being brave once, even if it cost me everything, was better than being a coward forever." Bill found himself looking forward to the visits more than he expected. Kyle was genuinely trying, to become someone better. He'd enrolled in prison education programs, was working on a degree in social work, planned to help others when he was released. Whether it was genuine transformation or just extended performance, Bill couldn't quite tell, but the effort seemed real enough to matter. The Patricia Thornton Veterans Foundation was established 14 months after the trial. Bill committed $200 million initially, with instructions that all mineral royalties from Devil's Canyon Ranch would fund it in perpetuity. The mission was comprehensive: housing for homeless veterans, PTSD treatment, job training, family counseling, scholarships. The first project was converting part of the ranch into a residential community. Bill worked with architects to design cabins that provided privacy and dignity, small homes scattered across the property, each with a porch and mountain views. Construction began in spring. Bill was there most days despite Roy's protests that he should supervise rather than labor. "I'm 73, Bill told Roy. "I've got maybe 10 good years left if I'm lucky. I'm not spending them sitting in an office watching other people work." The security team Roy had assembled after the attack was gradually disbanded over the following year as threats diminished. Most of the veterans transitioned to other security work, but two stayed on as ranch hands, finding purpose in the land and the work. The first residents arrived in summer, 8 veterans whose lives had fallen apart after service. Bill met each one personally, shook their hands, welcomed them home. One of the first was a Marine named Carlos Mendez, 42, Afghanistan veteran, who'd lost his leg to an IED and his family to PTSD that followed. Bill sat with Carlos on his cabin porch and told him the truth. "This isn't charity. This is payment of a debt. You served. Your country owes you more than a cabin and a view. But it's a start." Carlos looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Why are you doing this?" Bill considered the question. "Because my brother gave me more money than I need and I watched my children destroy themselves chasing more. Because my wife asked me not to die alone and helping people feels less alone than sitting in a big house counting money. Because you deserve better than a bridge and I have the means to provide it." The program grew. By the end of the first year, 43 veterans lived at Devil's Canyon. Some worked the ranch. Others took classes. Many just existed for a while, healing in silence in space that military life never provided. Dr. Martinez established a medical clinic on the property, hiring 2 other doctors, both veterans, who understood combat trauma. The clinic became a hub of activity, veterans gathering not just for appointments but for community. Media coverage of the foundation was extensive, but Bill never gave interviews, never sought credit. The work was its own reward. Watching Carlos get sober and reconcile with his daughter. Seeing a Vietnam veteran named Thomas find peace after 40 years of nightmares. These were the returns that mattered. 2 years after Kyle entered prison, Bill received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, 24 years old, appeared at the ranch asking to see him. Her name was Emma Thornton, Kyle's daughter from a brief marriage that had ended in divorce when she was 3. "I haven't seen my father in 20 years, Emma said when Bill invited her onto the porch. "My mom moved us to California and broke contact. I didn't even know he was in prison until I saw news coverage of the trial. I've been trying to decide if I should visit him." "Why are you here?" Bill asked gently. "Because before I see him, I wanted to meet you. Wanted to understand the man my father testified for. The man he went to prison trying to help." They talked for hours. Emma was a teacher working with underprivileged kids in Los Angeles. She'd grown up knowing her father was an attorney, but nothing about his character or choices. The news coverage had shocked her, learning he was both a criminal and someone who'd found courage to testify against his siblings. "Is he really trying to change?" Emma asked, "or is it an act?" Bill thought about monthly visits, about conversations with a son trying to rebuild himself from rubble. "I think he's trying. Whether he'll succeed, I don't know, but the trying is real." "Will you come with me? To visit him?" "I don't know if I can face him alone." Bill agreed, and 3 days later, they drove together to the Colorado facility. Kyle's face when he saw Emma was pure shock, followed by tears he didn't try to hide. "Baby girl," he said, his voice breaking. "You're here." "Don't call me that," Emma said, her own tears flowing. "You gave up that right when you abandoned me 20 years ago." The visit was painful and awkward and necessary. Emma confronted her father about abandonment, about choosing career over family, about missing her entire childhood. Kyle absorbed it without defense, acknowledging every failure, offering no excuses. "I was a coward," he told her. "With you, with Grandpa, with everyone who deserved better. I'm trying to be brave now, but it's 20 years too late for you, and I'm sorry. I can't fix those years. All I can do is promise to be someone you won't be ashamed of from here forward." By the end of the visit, nothing was resolved, but something had shifted. Emma agreed to visit again. Maybe build something new from the wreckage of what should have been. After she left, Kyle and Bill sat in the visiting room in silence. "Thank you," Kyle said finally, "for bringing her, for giving me a chance I don't deserve." "You've got 2 years left in here," Bill said. "Use them. Become someone she can be proud of, someone I can be proud of. That's all the redemption available to any of us, doing better than we did before." The foundation expanded beyond Devil's Canyon. Bill funded similar programs in Montana, Colorado, and Oregon, each tailored to local needs but following the same model: housing, healthcare, purpose, community. By the 3rd year, Over 500 veterans were being helped annually. Suicide rates among participants dropped to nearly zero. Employment rates climbed above 70%. Family reunifications happened regularly. Bill walked through those successes, feeling Patricia's presence. She'd always wanted to help people, had spent her life as a librarian, helping children discover reading. This foundation was her dream given form through his inheritance. Doc Martinez noticed the change in Bill around the 4th anniversary of the trial. He smiled more readily. His shoulders seemed less weighted. The grief that had hung on him was lightening, not disappearing, but becoming manageable. "You look happy," she observed one evening. Bill considered this. "I don't know about happy, but I feel useful. That's close enough." "Close enough is all any of us get." Patricia would be proud. Jim would be too, she added. "You protected his legacy and transformed it into something better than he could have imagined." Bill looked out at Devil's Canyon, at the cabins where veterans were building new lives, at the clinic where healing happened daily. His brother had built an empire and died alone. Bill had inherited that empire and used it to prevent other people from dying alone. The symmetry felt right. Kyle was released from prison on a cold morning in November, having served his full 2 years. Bill was there to meet him at the gate, along with Emma, who'd visited her father monthly and built something that almost resembled a relationship. Kyle emerged looking thinner, older, weathered by confinement and reflection. He wore donated civilian clothes and carried a small bag containing everything he owned. He saw Bill and Emma and stopped, overcome by emotion. "Come on," Bill said. "Oh, let's go home." They drove to Devil's Canyon Ranch, where Bill had prepared a cabin for Kyle. Not charity, but an offer. Kyle could live there while he got his social work degree, could help with the foundation, could earn his place through service rather than entitlement. "I don't deserve this," Kyle said, standing in the cabin that would be his. "No one deserves anything," Bill replied. "We earn what we get through choices. You made terrible choices. Now you're making better ones. Keep making better ones, and maybe someday deserve won't matter as much as did." Kyle worked at the foundation for the next 2 years, completing his degree online while counseling veterans, sharing his story of cowardice and redemption, showing others that change was possible even after catastrophic failure. Emma visited often, her relationship with her father slowly building into something genuine. On a cold morning in November, 5 years after inheriting the ranch, Bill woke at 5 as always and walked out to find frost covering the world in white crystal. He was 77 years old, slowing down but still sharp, still engaged in the work that gave his life meaning. He walked the property alone, boots crunching through frozen grass. He passed cabins where veterans slept, their lives slowly piecing back together. He passed the community center where tonight there'd be a Thanksgiving dinner for over 100 people gathering to share gratitude. He reached the edge of the property where fence ended and wilderness began, mountains rising in the distance. Bill stood watching the sunrise, painting frost gold and pink before heat began inevitable melting. This was enough, this moment, this place, this purpose. He'd lost his wife and 2 children to prison and 40 years with his brother. But he'd survived and found meaning in helping others avoid the isolation he'd known. Bill turned back toward the ranch house as full daylight arrived. He had work to do, veterans to check on, a foundation to guide. Kyle was in the community center preparing for tonight's dinner. Emma was bringing her fiancé to meet Bill. Roy was planning retirement but staying on as advisor. Doc Martinez was hiring another doctor to handle growing patient load. Life was finding its rhythm, damaged but functional, scarred but still capable of growth. Bill Thornton died in his sleep at age 77, 5 years after the trial, and 7 years after inheriting Devil's Canyon Ranch. He went peacefully, no pain, no warning, just a life that had run its course and ended the way it had been lived, with quiet dignity. They found him in the morning, still in bed, looking like he'd simply decided to keep sleeping. Doc Martinez confirmed death and closed his eyes. This friend who'd survived war and loss and betrayal, finally earning rest. The funeral was held at Devil's Canyon Ranch. Over 500 people attended, veterans from across the country who'd been helped by the foundation, staff whose lives Bill had touched, locals who'd watched him transform inheritance into impact. Kyle delivered a eulogy that left no eye dry. "My father was a good man, married to a good woman, who somehow raised 3 children, 2 of whom became criminals and 1 who became a coward. That failure haunted him. But what he built from that failure, this foundation, this community, This proof that broken people can heal and lost people can find their way home, that's his real legacy, not the money or the ranch. This, he gestured to the assembled veterans and staff. All of you, that's what my father leaves behind. They buried Bill next to Patricia on a ridge overlooking Devil's Canyon, two headstones side by side marking the end of a 50-year partnership that death had interrupted but not destroyed. The inscription on Bill's stone was simple: Colonel William Thornton, 1952 to 2029. Served with honor, lived with purpose, died with peace. Roy spoke last at the graveside, his voice rough with emotion. Bill was my friend, my boss, the brother Jim needed when blood failed them both. He took a stranger's gift and turned it into thousands of people's salvation. That's legacy. That's what matters. The foundation continued, endowed with resources that would fund it indefinitely. The ranch remained wild, protected forever. Over 3,000 veterans would find homes through foundation programs in the decade after Bill's death. Kyle took over as foundation director, Emma joining as education coordinator. Together they expanded programs, helped more veterans, honored Bill's vision of turning tragedy into meaning. The security team veterans who'd stayed on as ranch hands maintained the property with the same care Bill had demanded. Jackson served his full 18 years, released at 67, broken and forgotten. He attempted contact with Kyle once, seeking money or forgiveness or something. Kyle sent him a brief letter. I forgive you because holding anger would dishonor Dad. But I can't help you. You made choices. Live with them. Rebecca died in prison at 63. Heart attack, the medical examiner ruled natural causes, but everyone suspected was the body's surrender to a life lived without conscience. Kyle attended her funeral alone, burying his sister with grace she'd never shown others. Vincent Cross, the attorney, died 5 years after the trial, his legal career never recovering from the scandal. He'd paid Bill's legal fees in monthly installments until death relieved him of the debt. Senator Calloway was extradited 6 years after fleeing, stood trial, and was convicted on multiple corruption charges. He died in federal prison, unmourned and unremembered. The story of Bill Thornton and Devil's Canyon Ranch became legend, told in veterans' halls and foundation meetings and anywhere people gathered to discuss the power of second chances. It was a story about choice. Bill had chosen honor when greed would have been easier. He'd chosen service when comfort was available. He'd chosen justice when vengeance would have been satisfying. He'd chosen to give Kyle a second chance when abandonment would have been justified. Those choices didn't erase his failures as a father. They didn't resurrect his dead wife or reconcile him with his brother before it was too late. But they transformed tragedy into meaning, inheritance into legacy, and one man's suffering into thousands of people's salvation. Years after Bill's death, a young Marine named Sarah Chen arrived at Devil's Canyon Ranch, homeless and broken after 3 tours in Iraq. She was given a cabin overlooking the valley where Bill was buried. She was welcomed by staff who'd never met Bill, but carried forward his vision. Sarah asked about the man whose foundation had saved her. Kyle told her the story, all of it, the betrayal and the trial, and the choice to build rather than destroy. He gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, Kyle said. Taught me that it's never too late to choose differently. That's what this place does. Gives people chances they don't deserve but desperately need. Sarah walked up to the ridge where Bill and Patricia were buried, standing between their headstones as sun set over mountains that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. Thank you, she said to ghosts in silence. You saved my life. The wind carried her words into Wyoming wilderness, into the sky that had witnessed Bill's arrival and his battles and his eventual peace. The ranch continued its work, the foundation expanded its reach, and the legacy of a man who'd lost everything before finding what mattered most lived on in every veteran who found refuge in the shadow of eternal mountains. Bill Thornton had been a colonel, a husband, a father who failed 2 children and partially salvaged 1, a fighter, and finally a man who understood that wealth meant nothing without purpose, and family was defined by loyalty rather than blood. He'd inherited money he didn't want and used it to build something that would outlast him. That was enough. That was everything. That was the inheritance that mattered most. Not millions in bank accounts, but thousands of lives touched by a choice to help rather than hoard, to build rather than destroy, to honor the dead by serving the living. Devil's Canyon Ranch stood testament to that choice. Cabins full of veterans finding peace, a clinic healing wounds, a community center echoing with laughter that had replaced isolation. The land remained wild as Jim had wanted and Bill had protected. The work continued as Patricia would have dreamed and Bill had implemented. And Kyle carried forward the vision, a coward who'd found courage and used his second chance to give others theirs. On the ridge above the valley, two headstones marked the resting place of a couple who'd loved each other through 50 years of joy and struggle, who died apart but were buried together, whose legacy wasn't their children, but the foundation that bore Patricia's name and embodied Bill's values. The sun set over Devil's Canyon the way it had for millions of years, painting the world in golden shadow, promising another sunrise for those patient enough to wait. The veterans in their cabins prepared for another night of sleep that came easier here. The foundation staff drove home to families, knowing tomorrow they'd return to work that mattered. And if you listened carefully in the silence of the valley, you could almost hear two old soldiers sharing a beer on a porch that no longer existed, talking about choices and consequences and the stubborn refusal to surrender that had defined them both. Bill Thornton had won his final battle not through violence or litigation, but through the simple act of caring when caring was hard. He'd honored his brother, his wife, his one redeemable son, and most importantly, himself. He'd proven that inheritance wasn't about what you received, but what you did with it. That family was built through loyalty rather than born through blood, and that meaning came from serving something larger than yourself. That was legacy. That was honor. That was enough.